I'm Tony Esselin.
And I'm Amy Bernard.
And we are here to help make it make sense.
This is the podcast that takes complicated science and breaks it down into easy to understand language.
So buckle up, buttercups. You are in for a bumpy ride.
All right, everybody. Welcome to the podcast. We have an amazing guest today, and probably we've had great guests. I am so excited about this. I've been thinking about this and talking about this for a couple months now, and Dr. Tony can attest.
Yes. Yes. So I'm sending your top tier guests here at Help Make It Make Sense.
Exactly.
Okay. And this is again, cream of the crop here to talk to us about all things important that we love and adore. And
exactly.
Dr. Amy's losing her mind right now because she's so about this guest.
I know.
So
I'm
go
so
ahead
excited.
with the introduction.
So we have Evan Thornburg with us. Evan is a bioethicist, and misinformation, disinformation, and conspiracy theory as a threat to public health is the area of expertise. So what I'm going to do is to ask Evan to introduce your inspiration, how you got here, any stories, just give us the scoop.
Oh man, the scoop. So I go by Evan, the bioethicist on TikTok, where we met, as all new relationships form on social media. I work in public health, so that's how I started before I got my master's degree in bioethics. And I will say that I've always been interested in, so the general question that I think had been asked originally was about my interest in bioethics, just generally. And I have always been interested. I was actually pre-med in undergrad. I am not good at organic chemistry or bio or any of that. I learned it is not my calling. I also realized pretty early on that I didn't have an interest in individualized healthcare. A lot of your training when you go through to be an MD, even pre-med, is considering individualized healthcare. I just really didn't care about an individual person's health as much as I cared about what does health look like as a populace, as a more philosophic question. I mean, I love asking how would one define health? How do you say how is that defined for an individual, right? But then how would you define that for a community? I like asking those big picture questions. I'm not really very invested in being able to diagnose your broken arm. There's people for that. It's not me. And growing up as a little Black person in Philadelphia, you kind of don't learn about the nuance of healthcare, that you can be in health and not be a doctor. So when I discovered bioethics, I was really kind of astounded that nobody told me about it, because it was exactly what I wanted to do. Was this I wanted to ask these big picture questions. I wanted to kind of examine how we talk about health, or how health is discussed for people, how we make choices. Mainly, that's a lot of what bioethics is how do we make choices? How do we design policy? How do we make those decisions? And so it seemed kind of really perfect in the niche. And I had been working in public health for several years at that point. So it all just kind of came together in that way, because I love public health. I love talking about population health. I love talking about what makes people healthy at home and together in a community. That's a lot. That's all of what I do. And living through COVID, it's been really prescient, I will say, if that's how you say the word, is this idea of talking about population health in a more earnest way than we have really ever discussed in a space. I think the only people who talked about population health and public health for a long time was people who worked in it directly, and sort of everybody else was sort of okay. There are people doing that. There are nerds working on that. But now we're all talking about it, right? And we're all thinking critically around oh my God, I have been, and especially in the encapsulated in things like capitalism, where it's oh, I've been just getting on the train and going to work with a cold and just coughing on everybody on the train, and best of luck to them. COVID has really changed how we talk about it. I work in HIV, so I think that community has really understood the gravity of group health, but most people haven't until now, which is pretty amazing because it's like the first time in like 100 years.
Yeah. What I want to tell our listeners, just in case they don't know, but the way that I found you was that I am on TikTok and I watch TikTok videos. And, as the algorithm works and gives you things that you like, I get more and more health and science and some legal, things like that. And one thing that impressed me about you is that you have this amazing way of explaining, I think, bioethics and health literacy and all of these things in a very easy to understand and approachable way that I was like, wow, this is someone special. This is amazing. And I remember I think I sent Tony a text and I was like, okay, I'm going to invite this person on to our podcast. I'm not sure that the person will come because we have very few listeners, but I really, really want, so I just find that the way that you break things down is very impressive. And what I would love to hear from you is, can you explain to our listeners health literacy and what that means? I know.
No, it is one of my favorite topics. It's so funny that you mentioned that because it's like I know I've wore my coworkers out. Like every time something comes up at work, I'm like, well, that would be health literacy, right? And they're like, that's enough out of you. Like, keep it down.
Well, I'm inviting
Or
you. I give you free reign right now.
or they're like, they put something on my desk and I'm like, but is it health literate? And they're like, that's enough out of you. Um, So health literacy is the concept of like how well we understand the language that's used in health and healthcare and medicine. Um, Other things affect it. So that would be science literacy, right? Because but science literacy specific to health or specific to the health sciences. Scientism, which is the imagined or kind of invented conceptualization around science. So thinking science can do all these things that science maybe can't do, or using the language that is pseudo-scientific or language that seems scientific to mislead people or give an impression that science is involved when it may not be. That's scientism. Um, and so health literacy is a huge component of how we understand health care and our own health. So, for example, a really great example that I saw and I love to use social media examples because they're always going to be better. Real examples that people place on social media are always going to be better than anything I could invent. Um, and so, one of the best ones I saw is that a woman who was living with cancer had been told by prior doctors that her illness had been progressing. It had been progressing. She started with a new specialist, and that new specialist um, was telling her, was giving her sort of like a final, like, we've exhausted all possibility and we want to start, having a conversation about final decisions. And the woman was baffled. She became upset and really like scared and was like, what do you mean? Like, I thought I was getting better. And the specialist was very confused because this woman had been very consistently going to her checkups and her care and receiving care. And so she was like, well, they kept telling me it was progressing. And so for this woman, she understood the word progressing to mean the same way that she's encountered it in regular real space and time, which is probably at work or probably at school. And progression is a good thing. It means things are going along positively. Progression in diagnoses or progression in care and prognosis is a terrible thing when it comes to cancer, but nobody explained that this term had swapped its value stamps, its underpinned value in cancer care, in oncology. So that's health literacy, that this every one of people who she encountered that did healthcare understood what they meant by progression. She, a person not in healthcare, did not understand which. So she was going home and telling her family she was getting better. She was going home and having a conversation thinking that she was improving. And it wasn't until the specialist, they had like an awkward conversation where the woman was baffled at the fact that she was having to have a conversation about her mortality being imminent, that they realized. If that's like the best explanation of health literacy, I think.
Yeah, wow, that is awful and unfortunate. And I can totally see how someone who doesn't understand healthcare, who isn't a healthcare provider, who isn't a doctor, who isn't an oncologist, would think that word, like progressing, I'm getting better, I'm moving forward, when they meant the cancer was progressing, the cancer is getting better, the cancer is, yeah. Okay. Wow. That is,
And
Well, I
in
think
bio, go ahead.
no, go ahead.
I was going to say, in bioethics, one of the things that we point out very early on, that we learn, is that doctors frequently talk about a illness or a disease. People frequently hear you talking about their personhood. And that's why it's very important to have an understanding of health literacy, because doctors are taught like how to talk about an illness as if it's separate from the person. But you're talking about me. Like when I go into my PCP and I talk about my chronic illness, I don't experience it as like my doctor's talking about this third thing between us. I talk about this I mean, when I'm receiving information, I'm receiving information about my personhood and what we call as narrative ethics. The experience of illness versus the isolated information of disease are two different things. And a lot of people who do healthcare are taught to talk about the isolated disease as like a third, unencumbered, non-personified entity. But the patient does not separate themselves from their disease. They are having a full experience. There is personhood to their illness. And that's why it's important. And so what you see with that woman is both health literacy, but also narrative ethics, that she thought these people were talking about her. And so it would make sense that when you're talking about a person who's doing everything that they can, who's being consistent, progression would be interpreted as positive.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think one of the things that, we try to instill in health communication when we're talking to patients is like, after you finish your spiel, now you have to have them teach it back to you. Like, what is it that what did I just say? And I do that very often with my patients. Like, okay, I just said a lot of stuff. What did you hear me say? Because that is what's going to tell you if you're on the same page or if you're not on the same page. And what I tell my patients to do is, like, when they're going to a specialist or if they're going to speak to somebody else who's maybe not be so in tune with that, to make sure that you read back to them what you understood. Like, what did you understand they say to you? Because what we think they understand and what they understand are two totally different things, is exactly for what you're talking about, because we're trying to take care of, like, your anatomy and your physiology. We're trying to make sure that that's all in tune and that's all in line, and the science of it. And then there's a human being interpreting that science on a personal level that's just not actually gelling with the goals, right? So that's why it's really important to kind of sit down and say, hey, this is what's going on, this is what I'm feeling, and this is what I've heard you say. And if you don't do that, and if you don't force your healthcare practitioner to hear what you have heard, you're going to have a miscommunication. Like, that's a guarantee. If you don't, if there's not an effort on the healthcare provider to understand what you've said, and then if you don't advocate for yourself as well to make sure that you are heard, that's where the miscommunication comes in. So really important points.
I would also further that as a basic scientist myself, PhD scientist, one of the things that we are, and I'm going to say we as like this global category of scientists, are terrible at communicating our science to the public. As we all know, through training, we go through progressive levels of knowing nothing to knowing more and more. And as we progress, we like to use the big words and all the jargon because we want to sound like a professional. We want the faculty that are teaching us, we want our colleagues, our professional colleagues, to think that we are scientists in the field that we are training in or that we have trained in. And because of that, we use all this jargon. And as we get farther away from the beginning, we forget what it's like to not understand and not have the terms or the words. And also, so we start only using jargon. And then we also forget, what it was like in the beginning, and we don't have training. So there's not, in the PhD realm, most people, and even master's, PhD, physicians, physician assistants, dental students, I teach all of these students at my medical campus, and there's no training for science communication. It's lacking. It's, there's so much effort and time spent on training to get the jargon and to understand the complicated science, which absolutely is important. But having the ability to communicate with the people in the general public, no one's going to understand the impact of science. No one's going to understand how health has been improved or how to make decisions on your healthcare and on your body and what you do with all of the craziness that comes at us every day. If we don't communicate to the public in a way that allows them to understand the science and make these, really good, best healthcare decisions that they can for themselves. So that's one of my missions, as I started a science communication workshop for trainees on our campus, but also Tony and I started this podcast because we were getting a million questions from people that we knew in our community during the pandemic, asking us, what is COVID? How do these vaccines work? All these questions that thankfully people thought we were approachable. That's a good start. But I guess, how do we go about, what do you think about us, where we are today in the context of communicating to the public, and then just, I know this is another big question, like misinformation, disinformation, conspiracy theory. How do we go about combating that and getting better at what we're doing? I know you're participating in that. Your TikTok videos are amazing. Everyone should watch them. They should be mandatory. But what else?
Well, the answer to that question, I think, has several spheres that it lives in, because there's how we're communicating out, and then how we are. I think a lot of times in public health and in medicine or in healthcare, it's an us and them. And we lose this, and this is why we could get into a bigger conversation about the design of PhD programs and MD programs that really lock people more, folks who came from where I came from. I went to Philadelphia Public School. I'm going to tell you right now. I mean, I went to one of the better ones because I got very lucky and tested into one of our magnet schools, but I didn't pay any sort of fancy amounts of money to go to school. I got a full ride to my undergraduate, and I didn't do well in undergrad. I'll be the first person to tell anybody I didn't do well in undergrad. It was a small liberal arts college that was very prestigious in the realm of it was basically not an Ivy League, but it might as well have been because it lived inside of that realm. And I didn't do well. I got through it, but I didn't do well. And where does a person like me, because you're someone who's gone through a PhD program, you're someone who, as you said, has been awe-inspired by my TikTok. You can see that I have the intelligence. You can see that I have the grasp of the concepts. But if you looked at my undergraduate grades and I was to submit them to your college, I wouldn't even be considered. I would not get rotated. And maybe I could submit my TikTok as supplemental material, but ultimately a strong proportion of your colleagues would say this person can't do it because of the grades that I made when I first endeavored going to school post high school, post a public education. And I don't think I got a bad public education, but the amount of burning hoops that you have to jump through to dignify that education is very, very difficult. Like I even in this, the amount of times I had to say, like, I went to a magnet school. I didn't go to the regular public school. I went to the better of the public school, like that sort of thing. So we have to, all of that's to say is that we have to have a strong self-reflection moment here about elitism in medicine. And that picking the student who got straight A's, straight A's, straight A's does not necessarily make your most profound doctor. It makes your most proficient doctor. And that's fine. But profoundness and proficiency are two different worlds. Simultaneous to me, I had a very good friend who was, courted by every major education space in the land. She was skipped in grades. She got into University of Pennsylvania, full ride. She graduated at 20 years old. Um, she was flown out to Stanford and Brown and Princeton and Yale to do a PhD program. She was able to pick from all of them the PhD program she wanted to go to, and she dropped out within a year and hasn't even built a substantial career. This is not denigrating my friend. My friend is an amazing person, but my friend knows how to do school. My friend doesn't, to this day, in our mid 30s, struggles with the adult application of her learning. She knows what schools want to see in a student. She doesn't know, she has yet to discover what she as an adult does with any of it. And so sometimes the people who are not your A student, sometimes that C minus student that you can, when you look deeper at their application, you can see that they got a C minus in bio, but it's because they were also working 2 jobs to get through college. Like the fact that you could keep a C minus while working 2 jobs, like that's what you want to see in your doctors. That's what you want to see in folks. So the first thing we have to address is elitism. And elitism based on these sort of superfluous standards that are very centralized around grades and not really centralized around how is someone balancing the experience of education and a real life. Because a lot of the people who are able to get those straight A's are also people who have the kind of supports that if those supports disappeared for them, they would not have the grit to reestablish themselves. And this is, again, I know this is not me like deciding to like tear through people who are straight A students. There's plenty of them that do amazing work, but it is to think about we can't just be going for straight A students. And I think the other thing that happens with your straight A students or with these students that we clamor for in the medical world is that they want to display how well that they gathered the information you gave them, right? Somebody who gets straight A's or A pluses or a 4.5 GPA, that person is clamoring to make a point about their grasp of the information. And so they're going to use every big word that you taught them, which is cool. It's a cool party trick.
Mm-hmm.
But does it apply in the real world? And the question you have to ask yourself as a doctor, as a public health professional, as any of these things is, could I turn around after learning all this and talk to the person that I was at 16 and explain to them something? And if I can't, and then try that exercise again with myself at 10.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's really what I think about because that's where most people, adults, that's where their comprehension lives. It lives at that 16-year-old, it lives at that 10-year-old. That is the age range. Um, so that's our first conversation is that. And then also to then turn around and then say, what now that I've impressed all my professors and they all know that I know what gastroenteritis is and whatever, how do I just use regular language of the people to get it to them? Because I don't need to tell somebody gastroenteritis to explain that they have a stomach ache.
Right.
And I think that's where you see a lot of mistrust happen for a medical realm, is a lot of adults who are like, when they finally find out from somebody more willing to give them a commonality, when they're finally like, oh, gastroenteritis is like your stomach ache, they're like, why didn't they just say stomach ache? I see that all the time with people where they're like, why didn't they just say headache? Why didn't they just say high blood pressure instead of, hypertension? I don't know what that means. And they're sort of hurt and offended. Not using language that people understands really sucks the dignity out of their experience. And I don't know about any of you, but if you've ever had an undignified experience, you're not clamoring to go back.
No, that's
Um,
right. That's absolutely right. You're dropping bombs this morning. Dropping bombs this morning. No, absolutely. Everything that you said is spot on. And I think part of the reason that there is a market for all this misinformation, disinformation, and conspiracy theories is because we've had an exclusive profession, right? Like, so we've just become exclusive, and we're only, you're only welcome to understand if you're at our caliber, you know, and that's not the work. Like, the work is actually trying to keep everyone healthy, and everyone who's healthy needs you to be able to distill, explain, in a way that can actually be helpful to them to be able to take care of themselves. And I think that there's just this, there's something I reflect a lot about in my medical education. When I went to medical school, it was going to, and I'm also a student of public health system, of the public school system. I went to public school. I went to Hillcrest High School in Queens, New York. you know um and so I think that we I went to medical school, and I just, was struck by, like, the walls of the human beings that don't look like me with their bow ties, on the wall. And it's just this elite, like, this is where they discovered the operation of blah, 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 or whatever. And you're just like, it's like you're welcomed into this exclusive club, and that in order for you to be able to participate continually in this exclusive club, you have to speak the language, and you have to be able to not relate to your patients. Almost, it's almost like the opposite, because there were many times that I was chastised. It's one of the things that, that's why Amy and I get along so well, because we've always been like, this is ridiculous. Like, we need to be able to speak English. Like, this is dumb. And I did that throughout my entire career and was chastised for it. Like, I was really, there were times when I spoke to my PI, my principal investigator for my thesis, in English, and she would be irritated and be like, no, you need to go back and come back and speak to me in scientific language. And I was like, you understand what I'm saying, and so it's just kind of like, and then there's all these courses on, like, how to speak to patients, and this is how you have to do it. And I'd be like, why are we treating them like morons? Like, this is not cool. This is not all right. Like, that's not how you're supposed to talk to people. Like, you're supposed to talk to them not like they're stupid. You just need to speak to them in a language that they understand. It doesn't, like, I don't like the feel of this. And so I rebelled against that a lot in my training, and it's not looked upon very well. And I think that like, with a lot of the schools now, and the way that there's, social media has blown things wide open. You are forced to change the way you're thinking about how to communicate, because if you don't communicate in a way that folks will understand, then you're actually doing a disservice to your medical institution, right? To your actual institution. And that's what folks in these institutions are trying to protect. They're trying to protect this exclusivity. They're trying to protect this reputation that they're all of that. And this is actually starting to backfire in a way that they didn't actually imagine before.
Well, I think it's also to your point, right? Like, because one of the things I would ask you, and I think I can assume the answer too, is that the reason why you also became incensed at being told that you have to use this scientific language, or that people are being talked down to, is because it was personal. Like, I my mother is like a really big proponent of learning, but my mother is the first person in her family to get a 4-year degree. I'm the second person. Okay. Like, um and that's on both sides. I mean, my father is white. We could add race in here. My father is white. He has an associate's degree. I am more highly educated than my father, so there is we can have the conversation of race and like why my mother's family is not educated, and also like how different that is from my father's family. But my parents weren't just interested in me being educated because they thought it would create some upward mobility for me. They were interested in me being educated because they were interested in being educated, and they wanted to learn things too. My mother loved me coming home and sharing what I learned in grad school. My mother has a strong grasp of bioethics, having never stepped foot into a classroom, because she wanted to talk to me about what I was reading and the concepts. But if I had only used the language that I was presented in class, my mother would not be able to have those conversations with me, and so I would be living on a smart island in my home with my family. And I think that that's sort of why, like what you're talking about is like you were so incensed by it, because like you know these people, like you know them, you went to school with them, you know. I just saw um one of my friends from high school, her son is going to college. I mean, like, because she got pregnant at 19. Like that, like, I am amidst these people that you speak of. Like, I don't want to be an island at home. So I think a lot of students who come from these spaces, they learn, and I hate the term code switching, but you learn it. But then you sort of like, I think we're at a precipice point where we're like, well, why do I even need to do that? Because I'm code switching so that I make sense here, but we're learning to not make sense. That doesn't like, we are purposefully learning language that makes us less accessible and less informed. And like, God forbid if like every person who goes to the doctor consistently has as much understanding of health as the doctors. Why is that? Like, why are we gatekeeping health in this way? Because not everybody wants to be a doctor, even if they have all the information. Like,
This brings me to, no, I completely agree with what you're saying. This brings me to an important point that I want to pick your brain on, because I know you know and you have good ideas. So, because we have this gatekeeping of information and we use all these really big terms, and like people often cite journal articles that people can't get access to, or even if they do, they're filled with big words that people can't. I mean, it's crazy, right? So when people go to their doctor, as you were just mentioning, and they come in and they're like, look what I found on the internet. And they see a lot of misinformation, they see disinformation, they see conspiracy theories, they see things that are broken down into easy to understand language that appeals to them, that in most cases is visually more attractive. They do it better. How do we combat that type of thing? Because those types of things are immediately available. They're available in abundance and they are easy to understand. And here we have our, gatekeeping journal articles, jargon. It's something I think about all the time. How do we make this better?
I mean, you have to stop gatekeeping the information. I think it should be a requisite that every journal article, whether it's behind a paywall or not, have as part and parcel of its publishing requisite, have a simplified version that is open source. I just do. I don't think it makes if your work is published, it doesn't matter if someone has to pay $34.95 to get it or not. Like, it's published. Like, it's even when it's open source, it is attributed to you, it is published to you. There is no point on this earth and beyond why you need to keep that from people. And I like that you said, Tony, you said the word distill. And I think that's like such a key component of this, because I had a colleague that having this exact sort of conversation with, where I was telling them, I was like, you can just simplify your language. And they were like, but isn't that dumbing it down? And I felt my insides like squeeze, because I was just like, oh, like, why does something have to be dumb to be simple? Like, and so I said, nothing is dumb, things are distilled. And when I put it that way, my colleague was like, oh. And I was like, yeah, like, I don't think that rose water or rose oil or roses, I don't think any one of those things is dumb. I think that they're all forms of rose, and they're all consumable in
Yeah.
different ways, right?
I say that all the time when I am talking to the trainees in the workshop that I just recently started, or just anybody in general. I say, do not use the term dumb down. First of all, I can't stand it. It makes it makes it sound like you are this elite person, like you were saying, and that you're talking to people that, are not as smart as you. And I said, look, there are people who are much more intelligent than me that don't know how vaccines work. My job is to simplify it so that they can understand the science. Just like when I go and talk to, a lawyer about some legal thing, I'm hoping that they will simplify it for me or
Right.
distill it, because, I have the intelligence to probably understand it. I just don't have the training to know all of what they know. So I agree with you. The dumbing it down is like, I hate hearing that term. I hate when people use it. It is the bane of my existence for science communication. So sorry to interrupt, but continue.
No, but I think that it's all comes back to the goal of othering, right? Like that's
Right.
what it comes down to. It's like, I have this and you don't. Do you know what I mean? And it's like that's what it's about, right? And it's stupid. That part is stupid. That's the dumb part, is that like you actually subscribing to this othering is the dumb part of what
And
we're
I
talking.
and we don't look at clients, or we don't, because medicine has such an elite Western medicine, because there's a whole world we could endeavor um, around the conversation of how Western medicine has forcibly made itself the profoundest form of medicine. That's not, again, not minimizing Western medicine, but to understand that there was an intentional campaign to eradicate things like pulsotomy or pulsory in like traditional Chinese medicine, and Ayurvedic practices, like um, even root work by enslaved African peoples. Like, I don't know the science of these things, but none of us know the science of these things, and we're able to explore them because Western medicine said all of that is gibberish. There is no truth to it, just Western medicine. And because of that, at a time when all of it was sort of gibberish and we were all sort of finding our way around, like Western medicine had decided to make itself stand out in the most profound way when it was still doing like, leeching, so I don't know, girlies, we were all trying hard at the time, right? But Western medicine decided to eradicate the viability of these other formats of medicine. And so starting strong with elitism and pulling itself above all other like initial exploratory ways to address health and medicine and care. And we've kind of carried that attitude through a lot of medicine and healthcare. And we've even built it in like a really weird, staggering way. I mean, if you tell people that you work in public health, I mean, folks who work in a vast array of medicine minimize that. Well, baby, we're doing the same thing, right? Like, if I don't get enough people vaccinated, you're going to see way too many people in your hospital. Like, we work together.
Right.
And so there's also that. You can see that in the way that we pay people. I mean, the way we pay people in public health versus, you can't make more than maybe $120,000, $140,000. And now that's a lot of money for some people, for a lot of people. But when you compare that cap in public health to the caps that exist in medicine, like,
Right.
you know,
Right.
you can make $900,000 just doing spinal surgery, you know, like.
Let's not even add like the educators in this country are far, far underpaid. I know as a PhD.
Right.
The
Exactly.
difference
Right.
is as an educator, even like elementary school. I mean, that's one of the most important jobs and they make like nothing. It is awful. So yes, I agree 100%. We can't, we don't
All of
pay,
these
we
things work
don't
together.
value. Yes, we
All
don't
these things work
value this.
together.
So
And
I'm gonna, oh, go ahead. I'm so
they
sorry.
create that elitism. So in that elitism, I think it just doesn't, like you were saying, Tony, it does not serve us. And we're proving that it does not serve us because the truth of the matter is that we haven't stopped a lot of these things. They're still happening. And so what could we be doing better? And it's probably starting to make ourselves more relatable and accessible. That's the other thing too, is accessibility. You mentioned that we're talking about the language being inaccessible, but also like you're not relatable. I mean, even I don't know, like early on when we started this podcast, I said, "Oh, I wasn't good at organic chemistry and I wasn't good at biology." I keep trying to challenge myself to believe that I didn't have good, relatable education either in those classes. And they changed the trajectory of my life.
Mhm.
I mean,
Right. No, that's absolutely right. No, I think that that's absolutely right. I think that one of the things that I have a question for you. So one of the reasons why we start, like we said, we started this podcast is because, you know, friends and family. I mean, I'm Haitian. I love to say how Haitian I am. I'm very Haitian. And my family believes in, you know, herbal medicine and all of that stuff. And I do not poo-poo it. I believe in it too, for when it comes to certain things. I think that there can be a balance. I don't believe in all and nothing. I believe that there needs to be a balance when it comes to natural remedies and then also modern medication, for example. But when, you know, at the beginning of this pandemic, there were a lot of, you know, crazy videos and EMF, and me and Amy were I was like, what is EMF? Like, what does
oh
that
man.
do with medicine? You know, but all of this stuff. And I, you know, I have a lot of family members. Like I started off doing Zoom presentations with my family to talk about the vaccine, because I was like, listen, first of all, I need to be convinced that this vaccine is not going to kill my family. So I had to like dig into it. And then after I did that, then I was like, okay, if I feel good about this, I can't advocate for something that I don't feel good about. So once I started to feel good about it, then I was like, all right, now let me tell you the truth. And I was one of the only people in my circle. And we talk about this all the time with my colleagues. My colleagues were like, God, get vaccinated. It's good for you. And I was like, how do you know? You don't know that. Stop saying that. Like, let's get more information and let's talk about the information as we're getting it. And so that actually helped me a lot with my patients who were like, hell no, I'm not getting this. But because I never said it was an all be all end all cure, and I said that we're gonna, you know, there are things that we're still learning about it. This is the best way we can protect ourselves at the moment. The minute something else comes up, you know, I'll be the first to tell you, because I kind of went along this journey with them. A lot of people who were like, hell no, got vaccinated. A lot of them did, because they knew, they were like, Dr. Tony's not going to tell me a lie. You know, she's going to tell me what's up. Now, the reason I say all of this is because I am surrounded by family members who are totally into conspiracy theories. Like this is you send a 2.5-minute video about Bill Gates eating the head of a cow, and it's like, oh, this is what he's doing. Do you know what I'm saying? Like this is exactly what it's doing. And I got a really interesting question from one of my family members who said, and I wanted to bring it up. So I'm going to preface this by one of the conversations I had with one of my family members, who I was like, what would it take for you to trust this vaccine? What would it take? And that human being was like, I would have to be in the lab watching them do the experiments myself. And I was like, wow, we're really failing. And like, if you're that distrusting, then we're really failing. Now take that to the conversations in the chat rooms that my other family member was just telling me about. I think in Clubhouse and all of these other social media platforms, where they were like, how can you trust the fact checkers who are fact checking the information, because they are also working for the government and government agencies. So what would you say to that for like the fact checking is all part of the process to get us hurt, basically.
So this falls into, and I will be honest to say that I'm still really trying to extrapolate like what the best challenges to this. So one of the problems with what's called an infodemic, which is what we are living in, right? That's just there's too much being produced, and that's on all sides. Like misinformation, disinformation, and conspiracy theories have the benefit of they don't need, when you're making something up, you can make up as much as you want as with the time that you have allotted. So if you can pound out 17 pages an hour, well, you can write a bunch of pseudoscience papers all day. So that's number one, is that science can never compete with the amount of produced material that misinformation and disinformation, I'll say specifically, disinformation and conspiracy theories can produce. We just can't do it. I have to do so much or have such a good grasp of what I want to talk about when I make one video on TikTok. If I just wanted to talk about Bill Gates being the Antichrist, I could just shoot him off. I could just be vibing, just going off of vibes and feels.
Right.
Um, what this causes for a lot of people, this this immense amount of material that now exists in the stratosphere of where we go digging for information is always going to be, the disinformation is always going to eclipse the amount of correct information. The other thing too is that disinformation is more interesting, right? Because although it boils down to the same kind of premises, like, uh, um, white supremacy, patriarchy, all sorts of like homophobia, all these things, it constantly is spinning narratives and stories and like ideas that are new. I mean, it's an adventure. It's adventure time. Science is wholly boring because I don't need every scientist who's ever existed and ever will exist, who's done, uh, you know, research on the environment, to write 17 papers on climate crisis. At some point, we just agree and we can stop writing those papers. Like we can, and so that's the other reason why we will never eclipse the vast amount. And even if we could, we would just be reproducing what looks like the same thoughts, which is true because at some point science comes to consensus on things. Like climate crisis is real, or like we're made of cells, or like, no one's writing papers anymore about like how we are a cellular structure. And for
Right.
good reason. 'Cause we got it.
Right. You figured it.
So this all of that's to say is that this huge realm of ever growing kind of junk pile of information that is, and remember, for everyday folks, this pile is made of everything: correct information, incorrect information, disinformation, all of it. It's all in there. It's all together. And they have to sift through this pile. And every morning that they wake up, it's triple the size. It's quadruple the size. It has done something very unique. And that is, it has made the threshold for believability too high as well, right? It's also over instilled a certain level of suspicion and confidence, that people like. The pushback would be for that one family member that you had that's like, I'd have to be in the lab seeing them do the experiments, right? The reality is that if you could, let's say you found a way to do that, you brought them into the lab to see the experiments, they do not have the training to even know what they're looking at. And so that would still make them not believe. The threshold is too high, because in order for you to be certain, what you're basically saying is that I need to become a scientist to
Correct.
believe scientists.
Correct.
And
Correct.
they aren't really aware that that's what they're asking. And I would say the same thing about other disinformation as well. Like the whole the huge movement of people who don't believe in in voting machines. And I'm like, and that they can't be trusted, and that they can be, again, scientism does this to us, right? Convinces us that like there's some mainframe point that someone can like something out of like a like late 90s early 2000s like hacker film could be like, I'm in the mainframe, I'm changing the votes, and you're just like, that point doesn't exist. Like, I hate to tell you, as someone who like tallied the votes in Philadelphia, like it is so massive, the undertaking of counting almost 1 million votes in a city that's 1.6 million people. There is no one point that you could disrupt the counting of that and like change it on a huge demonstrative scale. It's just like not possible. But to that point of like, I think that's where, because again, that movie that I just made fun of makes sense to folks who are watching it and don't have any of that training. I watched with my mother-in-law and my partner this weekend, like several movies. One of them was about AI, like sort of AI in the military, and another one. And my mother-in-law, who's a very brilliant woman and loves sci-fi, after watching this AI movie, was like, "Well, I bet something like that could happen." And she is not a conspiratorial or a disinformation tuned person. She's very, very good at perceiving and consuming the right information. But it made me think about how like plausibility is enough to create deniability too, right? People could be putting nanoparticles into that like vaccine because nanoparticles are small. So how do I know they're not? Um,
Yeah.
the same
So
argument, and
yeah.
it's a Christo-fascist argument in a lot of ways, because Christo-fascism requires that we prove that there isn't a God, and that's not how that works. Like, you have to prove that there is one. Um, and as scientists, we're proving that these things work, but the argument is, no, 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 you have to prove all the ways that it doesn't harm. And you're like, that's just not
Mhm.
too big of a burden of body of proof. Um,
That
So
leads
we're
me to I completely agree with that. I know we're getting towards the end of time, and I want to be cognizant of that, even though I would love for this to continue for hours and hours. That point you just brought up reminds me of something that I have watched in some of your TikTok videos where you talk about the healing vacuum.
mhm.
And how can you just explain that, and how, like, with science, as an example, as an immunologist and vaccine advocate, Voldemort is responsible for, I don't say the person's name. Voldemort is responsible for a since retracted Lancet article in 97, 98, where they were talking about vaccines and autism, and we don't have an exact cause of autism. We know it's genetic. There's a lot of different factors that go into it, but we do know that it's not vaccines. However, and there have been millions of dollars and millions of so many thousands of studies and people that have played a role in trying to eliminate that from the public's mind, because that was that connection was made. But it's because we don't have like solid, this is what causes it. There's no virus or whatever. So can you just explain the healing vacuum? And I think that after that, we probably should end it, even though I don't want to.
I am around all the time. So the healing vacuum is the space that's left when there isn't explanation for something. And that really sucks, because COVID sort of had that, because we were all learning. One of the things that science requires is time, and sometimes time especially living in this current moment. I think the book Quiet does a really good has a really good explanation of living in sort of this like fast food style expectation of information. And so the healing vacuum is sort of the time that we used to have when we would ask people to be patient as science figured it out. Um, and the healing vacuum is that empty space of like, while we're waiting for science to figure it out, carpet bagging sort of zooms in. It's what I like to call carpet bagging because it's it's culturepreneurs. It's usually people looking to find a way to monetize off of the unknown. So before we had a vaccine and we had any explanations around COVID, I mean, immediately people were selling colloidal silver, my least favorite, but favorite supplement that people love to just start pitching, right? Televangelists, I mean, like Jim Baker was like, colloidal silver cures COVID, it cures your cancer, it'll cure your gout. Like, and depending on the background you have, depends on like how much science you decide to apply to it or how much belief or faith you decide to apply to it. Both are valuable. So in Jim Baker's case, he didn't have to use a lot of scientism. He just used the healing power of the Lord. The Lord showed him that colloidal silver would do this. And if you don't get better, it's because you don't believe in the Lord enough. And that's a really easy out. But people who are sort of pseudoscientific in their approach, whether they have like a PhD in chiro, there's a very large upcropping of people who are chiropractors or DOs who use this education and this degree to sell scientism or pseudoscience. They love swooping into that empty space and explaining the unexplainable. And the hard part is, and I don't know how we help people understand that, is that there are just things we still don't know in science. We have a hunch. I mean, like, the universe is always expanding. Into what? Everybody's got a theory, right? And again, I'm not schooled enough on the science of the universe and the science of, astrophysics to be able to even begin to endeavor that topic. So I will wait till an astrophysicist starts to tell me. But yeah, it's protecting people. It's sort of having to convince people that we need to wait and learn, and patience has run so thin in our current environment because of the way we've set up everything else in people's lives. I mean, I don't have to, in the middle of this interview, I could get coffee brought right to me. There's something, whereas 50, 100 years ago, I would have to get up, I would have to grind beans, I would have to boil water, I would have to go through the steps of coffee making. Now I can just be sitting here talking to you and even off screen order something, have it come right to where I'm sitting, and I have coffee, and it's going to have cream, and it's going to have sugar, and it's going to be hazelnut flavored. And how do we combat with that training is more of the question, because we've trained everybody that everything can come right to them the moment that they desire it, but science can't. That's where people are sort of like, that's what makes the disinformation more believable. It seems believable that colloidal silver could do all these things because science is so amazing. Why wouldn't it come up with a substance that could cure cancer, gout, and COVID at the same time? I don't know. But I can get coffee right to me, so why could it's that sort of, it sounds foolish, but it's actually, those are very tight parallels for a common person's mind, because they don't know how that coffee gets to them that quickly, and they don't understand how science works. And so there's a extended trust of like, it meets my needs immediately. So
Yeah, the whole thing of delayed gratification and having to work towards something, I think, is like a whole nother element that has gone missing. But that's like a whole nother thing. So Dr. Tony,
Yes.
I think we should probably end, but what I would say is that, Evan, I am incredibly thankful for organic chemistry not being your favorite subject, because I believe that you are in the perfect Like this is, I would encourage everyone to watch the TikTok videos, everything that you have. It's so well done. And I think this is exactly where you need to be. And I think that every healthcare professional, every public health, anyone, this should be mandatory viewing. So I'm so thankful that you were with us today. And Dr. Tony, do you want to?
Yeah, no, I think this was awesome. And I think that there's just so much more to unpack when it comes to this. And I think that like, if we were to summarize this, it sounds like we don't really have an answer yet as to how we can combat all of this.
Hello? Oh no. What happened? Shoot. Are you there?
Thank you so much for taking your time and entertaining us, just reaching out to you and saying, hey, jump on our podcast.
No, it was great. Thanks for having me. I think I'm glad that folks at your in your spaces are having these conversations and thinking critically about it. Because sometimes I feel like I'm a little isolated, although I've always encountered people being excited when I talk about it. But I'm glad that we're thinking about it. I think we'll probably have more of those answers once we get better at constructively organizing and understanding systemically and are able to better track these things. Right now, we're just having a conceptual conversation around misinformation, disinformation, and conspiracy theories in health and healthcare. But I think once we get better at being able to look at these things in a way that has trackability, has like data surveillance and ways that we can quantifiably like turn it into data that then tells the story of how like we can get ahead of things. But we first have to start to see the seriousness and put real resources and structure into addressing it. And that might mean having people that are in public health departments who just track bad information and how it's being spread, like a virus.
Right. Right.
But I am glad that the conversation is happening and it should continue to happen. And we should use the tools at our behest, which is social media and podcasts and these other forms of like edutainment. I don't think there's anything wrong with being entertaining and educating. I mean, Blue's Clues is.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, we're over here changing the world and help make it make sense.
I love that for you, which is why I will agree anytime, every time. That's what I'm
Oh,
here for.
awesome. That is so great. Well, thank you so much for joining us. This was
Thank
super
you.
exciting. And we'll make sure that all of your information is accessible in our show notes. So thank
I
you
love
so
it.
much.
Thank you again.